Hey guys, before we start the video, I just want to say that the giveaway for the Logitech G600 MMO mouse is still going on until January 10th, so there's still time to enter the contest. I'll be including steps on how to enter the giveaway in the description below. Now that that's out of the way, let's start with the video. So, I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV for almost 5 years now. I've got to experience all of the content that they've added. Well, most of the content. And while I didn't get to play A Realm Reborn at the time it released, I got the opportunity to play Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers all the way through. Well, again, most of the way through for Heavensward. But now, let's get started. Hey guys, what's up? It's Umbruhh here, and today I want to rank my favorite Final Fantasy XIV expansions from least favorite to most favorite. Now before we start this video, I just want to say I won't be including A Realm Reborn in this video for ranking my expansions because I don't consider it to be an expansion. I consider it to be the new, I guess, game that was remade from the original Final Fantasy XIV in 2010, which was a disaster, so I consider A Realm Reborn to be the vanilla. In this video, I'm just going to be talking about the expansions. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. So, my least favorite expansion out of all of the three that have been released so far is Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. So, you may have saw this coming. Now, I don't necessarily hate it, but there are a lot of gripes I have with it. But despite all the issues I do have with Stormblood, there are a lot of things it added that I did like it. Some of the things I love about Stormblood is the new jobs they added, Red Mage and Samurai. Red Mage is probably my favorite caster to play, because I love how versatile it is. I'm sorry for the pun. And just how mobile and straightforward it is to play. And I love mobility when I'm playing a caster. Like, if I was playing WoW, I would enjoy Mage compared to Warlock, just because it has quite a bit more mobility over it. So, sorry, Black Mage and Summoner. Plus, it's always fun mixing magic up with melee. And Samurai is an absolute treat to play, and definitely my favorite job to play aside from Dark Knight. I've always enjoyed sword-wielding powerhouse DPS classes, and Samurai is just the job for that. I love feeling like a master of combat, and just pulling off those double Madare crits is just so satisfying. And a good Samurai will often top the DPS charts. And another thing I did like about Stormblood is the Omega Raid series was really enjoyable, especially how it introduced a lot of bosses from previous Final Fantasy games, which definitely would tug at the nostalgia of older Final Fantasy players. But it's awesome how the Omega Raid series brings back classic bosses from previous Final Fantasy games like Exdeath or Kefka and Chaos. And one other thing I'd like to add about Stormblood that I liked is the addition of some really fun dungeons they had. And some of my favorite dungeons in this X-Pack were Kugane Castle, Alamigo, and Bardam's Medal. That boss that was just mechanics was really cool and unique. And it had some awesome trials too, most notably Susanoo, Shinryu, and especially Tsukuyomi, which was a sad fight, but it was really good and the music was awesome. And now on to why I didn't like Stormblood and why it's my least favorite expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. The main issue? I really wasn't a fan of the story for the most part. It felt like a huge step down from the story Heavensward was trying to bring, and the X-Pack being set in two different continents made the pacing feel very inconsistent. While it's a great idea in gameplay, like I love the idea of exploring Yerbania and Otherd, it just, how it was executed in the story didn't live up to expectations. Plus, none of the characters really stood out for me other than Fordola. Lise was a painfully boring character that is far inferior to when she was posing as her sister, Ida, which says a lot, who basically Lise takes credit for most of our actions, we freed Alamigo and took down Xenos and the Empire? Nope, that was all her. Yotsuyu, who, before her 5.x character arc, is just generic sexy villainess with a generic sexy villain backstory. Again, before the patch quests and she loses her memory and such. And while Xenos is a really cool character that's basically the antithesis of the Warrior of Light, I mean, I like Xenos personally as a villain. He's definitely a bit one-dimensional compared to other villains like Gaius, Thornton, Regula, and of course, Emmett Selk. And now, while I did enjoy the MSQ for 4.2 and 4.3, Yotsuyu's Amnesia arc, those were the only parts of the 4.x's MSQ that I actually enjoyed. The only interesting part of 4.1 was Fordola's arc in the throne room fight scene, and 4.4 felt like complete filler, except for that scene where Y'shtola burned the hell out of Magni. And 4.5 explained virtually nothing about what was going to happen in the next expansion and what it was going to be like, other than cryptic nonsense by the Crystal Exarch, but he was called Enigmatic Figure at the time. And at least 2.4 and 2.5 hinted that we were going to Ishgard, and same with 3.4 and 3.5 with Alamigo, but 4.5 didn't explain anything other than the Scions were getting taken away by the Crystal Exarch to God knows where, and none of us didn't know where the expansion was going to take place until they revealed it at the March Fan Fest in 2019. And another reason I hate Stormblood? Eureka. Fucking Eureka is the most mindless, grindy content I've ever experienced in Final Fantasy XIV. It was so boring and so mind-numbingly dull that I quit in the first zone after leveling up to level 6. I fucking hated it. Bajin Southern Front, on the other hand, I will get into that later. Now, onto the zones. Aside from Yangsha, I wasn't a fan of the new areas that they added in Stormblood. Most of the zones in Gurabania are more or less the same, just war-torn fields. The Ruby Sea is a complete pain in the ass to navigate until you can learn to fly there, and even though it's a beautiful zone, it's just 80% water, kind of like the human body. It's just the Vashir of Final Fantasy XIV. And while the Azim Steppes are cool, it just feels like an empty field, other than the Dawn Throne, and the lore with the Azim Steppes is really cool. And while I enjoy the settings of Ivalice, I dislike the return to Ivalice raids gameplay-wise for the most part. While I liked Orbon Monastery, the boss fights for the raid, most of the time I just did not have fun with these raids, especially with the bosses having mechanics that are far more challenging and confusing than previous Alliance raids, which is worse. I mean, yeah, you can always say, well, just get good, Umbruhh, you suck. I mean, yes, I could get good, but the 23 people in my alliance might not always know the mechanics, making this a huge pain in the ass to get through, and I just did not have much fun with these raids at all. It always felt more like a chore rather than an experience, and especially one of the things I hated about this expansion is what they did to Dark Knight this X-Pack. They took away some of their best abilities and just made them so reliant on Dark Arts. I mean, bear in mind, you did have to use Dark Arts quite a bit in Heavensward, but at least you had a lot more abilities and it was a lot more fun than it is now. Well, in Stormblood, I mean. And finally, Stormblood gave classes their own PvP abilities, which put combos on one button, and you only kept like 35% of your job's ability, and it really felt like your class is just being dumbed down for PvP. I just wish they would scale our level to max level and give us all of our abilities, like in deep dungeons, like Heaven on High, or Palace of the Dead, or even the Bajin Southern Front. Now we'll be going over to the Middle Child, my second favorite expansion, Heavensward. I love this expansion. It's great. I mean, yeah, there are some nitpicks I have with this expansion, but for the most part, I absolutely loved it, and after slogging through the MSQ of A Realm Reborn, it was such a reward to finally be able to experience this expansion. Now, let's get on to why I like this expansion so much. Now, the jobs. Where do I even begin? This is just my personal opinion, but all of the jobs they added this expansion are the best of their roles. Now, this is just for me personally. Now, I'm not good at playing a healer, but I love Astrologian. I just love the idea of being a fortune teller that heals with the power of cards and the stars. And Machinist is a really fun range DPS because of how powerful and how mobile it is, especially in Shadowbringers, since if you want to deal with mobs and deal lots of damage, why not use a gun? And of course you all saw this coming, the addition of Dark Knight, my favorite overall job in the game. Yeah, I'm an edgelord, whatever, but you get to be a complete badass that wields a greatsword, and the power of magic to protect your allies and smite your foes. And the gameplay for it is super fun. The weapons and artifact armor look really cool, and you get access to one of the best side stories in the game, the Dark Knight job quests. Seriously, they were so good and so well acclaimed that they had the writer for the Dark Knight job quests to write the story for Shadowbringers. That should tell you something. And the story was a massive improvement over A Realm Reborn, and so was the voice acting, if I might add, at least for the English dub. I'm not sure about the Japanese dub. The story of Heavensward focused on adventuring to Ishgard after fleeing from what happened in Ul'dah, A Realm Reborn, fighting against bloodthirsty dragons and zealots alike, while forging bonds with characters such as Aymeric, Estinian, Ysel, and of course, Orchiphant, Alone rest his soul. And I was always curious about Ishgard and its conflicts after learning about it while questing through A Realm Reborn, and I'm glad we were able to explore and learn more about its history and even visit the city of Ishgard and its surroundings. Ishgard is such a beautiful and breathtaking city. I'm a sucker for the high fantasy, or even gothic fantasy, I guess, in this take, and it's why I just love this city so much. And the endgame content they introduced this expansion was probably my favorite they did out of any expansion. The Alexander raids were really cool and fun. We got some straight up banger themes and bosses with really cool mechanics. Albeit, instead of fighting the embodiment of darkness or Imperials, we're just fighting against goofy time-traveling goblins and their machines. And you know what? That's okay. And I really enjoyed the Shadows of Mach, Mac? Whatever. The Shadows of Mach, which is my favorite Alliance raid series they added. It's more or less probably some of the only original raid series they've added this expansion. Although it does take inspiration from some other Final Fantasy games. I can't really recall if it's based off of anything or not. And some of the other things I love about Heavensward is the addition of the race, the Aura, which is probably my second favorite race in the game. Treasure map dungeons and deep dungeons like Palace of the Dead. Now, we'll get on to some of the things I didn't like about Heavensward. Most particularly the way Bard and Machinist played this expansion, thanks to Wanderer's Minuet and Gospel, which have been reworked since then, but at the time, all of their attacks more or less had cast times, essentially turning them into support-based caster DPSs, hence the reason why they were nicknamed the Bow Mage and Gun Mage respectively at the time. And despite how much I love the story for Heavensward, some parts just seem to drag on longer than they need to, most particularly when the heroes are journeying throughout Dravania and the Churning Mist to learn more about the Dragonsong War before they fight Nidhogg. It just kind of felt like a drag, to put it bluntly. And as for the dungeons, I didn't really like a lot of the dungeons in Heavensward when it first came out. Particularly the first three dungeons, the Dusk Vigil, Som-Al, and the Airy. While they aren't necessarily bad, I just don't find them particularly interesting or engaging. and I wasn't a fan of the design or the bosses, except for Nidhogg in the area, which was pretty cool. And my final gripe with Heavensward, I just don't like how you had to be max level to do PvP. After playing other MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, The Elder Scrolls Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, and Guild Wars 2, I just don't think that PvP is something that should be only restricted to those that are max level. Despite Stormblood removing most of your abilities, at least they reduced the level requirement to 30. Now we'll be getting on to my favorite expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. Now, with my disappointment with Stormblood at the time, I had a bad feeling about Shadowbringers personally, but thank God I was wrong. This expansion completely blew me away. There are so many things I love about this expansion, and it's probably the best DLC or expansion that I've played, if not one of the most that I've played in any video game. Now, let's start about what I love about Shadowbringers. The new gameplay changes implemented in this X-Pack were awesome, such as the reworks for certain jobs, most notably Machinist and Dark Knight. I seriously love Shadowbringers Dark Knight so much. The removal of TP, tanks getting reworked in general, the new jobs, Gunbreaker and Dancer, and so much more. Shadowbringers introduced a bunch of cool new game mechanics as well, and made alterations to existing mechanics that have really improved Final Fantasy XIV's gameplay. And now, why me and so many others love this expansion? The story. It's absolutely phenomenal, and like I mentioned, it was written by the same writer who wrote the Dark Knight job quests. Shadowbringers introduces us to Norvrant, a world that is being consumed by light, and it's up to us, the Warrior of Darkness, to restore darkness to the First, to not only save Norvrant, but to save the Source as well, which will prevent the 8th Umbruhh calamity. Shadowbringers also introduces to us so many well-written characters, most notably the Crystal Exarch, Ardbert, which was introduced in 3.4 as just a villain at the time, and Emmet Selk, the latter of which remains to be one of the most compelling and well-written characters that Final Fantasy XIV has seen. Definitely the best-written villain. I mean, you know he's evil, but his motivations are still tragic and understandable that you can't help but feel sympathy for him at times and understand, or have, I guess, an idea of why he's doing what he's doing. And as you progress through the story, you really become invested with the world and the people of Norvrant. And another thing too, this expansion is probably the darkest expansion we've seen in Final Fantasy XIV. I mean, if meeting somebody at the beginning of this X-Pack only for them to have revealed to be brutally devoured by a Sin Eater, the light equivalent of Void Scent in Norvrant, I don't know what will. It really helps emphasize what's at stake and how dire the situation is in Norvrant. Whereas in Eorzea, things go wrong with the fight against the Empire. It's okay, we'll regroup and get back on our feet. But when losing in Norvrant, you really feel the horrors of war against ravenous monsters around you. You see the desperation that people are facing each day just to see tomorrow. And we see what the Warrior of Darkness is willing to do to save the First, including absorbing the light of the Light Wardens, even if it slowly turns them into a Sin Eater. Plus, we finally get to learn more about the Ascians and their homeland of Amarant, instead of them just being evil, supernatural, Organization 13 looking cultists. Overall, I love the story of Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, with it being the best Final Fantasy story I've experienced so far, and perhaps one of the best stories I've seen in gaming. And the trials and dungeons in this X-Pack were great. Holminster Switch, Don Meg, Katana Ravel, I'm just kidding. Mount Gulg, Amarot, and all the other dungeons that they've added were great. and the trials were all really cool too. Titania, except for EX, which slowly caused me to lose my sanity. In its sense, Hades, Warrior of Light, and all the Ruby weapons, the weapon trials were great. And the endgame content in general with this X-Pack, I know there are some people that have gripes with it, but I personally enjoyed it, like the weapon trials, as I mentioned. The Eden Raid series, that has a lot of Final Fantasy VIII references, whereas kind of expanding on Final Fantasy XIV as well. The Nier raids, which I love, especially as somebody who really enjoys the Nier series. The Bajan Southern Front, like I mentioned, I didn't like Eureka, but the Bajan Southern Front felt a lot more enjoyable to me. I mean, certainly having kick-ass music helps, but I am able to enjoy the story a lot more. I don't know why, I just felt more drawn into the Bajan Southern Front than I ever was Eureka. And as a whole, I love the endgame content. And another thing to mention, some of the new gear that they introduced this X-Pack just looks fucking awesome. Some of the new weapons look great, some of the new armor look great. It's just, they really did a great job design-wise. And while this may be my favorite expansion they've added so far, there are some issues I have with it. Most notably, the implementation of the two new races, Viera and Hrothgar. What I don't like is how limited their customization options are. Like, Viera can only use a certain amount of hairstyles which are Viera exclusive, and Hrothgar can't even change their hairstyle at all, it's tied to their face. And alongside that, they can't wear most headpieces, which is ridiculous. I really don't see the reason behind it too. Like, it's hard to animate, but... And if you're worried about the ears getting in the way, why not just have the ears sticking through the headpiece like you did with Aura? I just think the implementation of Viera and Hrothgar just was one of the downfalls of this X-Pack, especially when you saw a lot of people switching back to some of their previous races like Mikode, Aura, Hure, etc. And another issue I had with this expansion so far is the lack of content compared to previous expansions, such as less dungeons, relic weapon content releasing halfway through the expansion. Wasn't my favorite parts, although it's not their fault at all, because of everything happening in the world is preventing people from going to their jobs. I can't say it otherwise, I will get demonetized, but essentially it's made development a lot harder, and I can understand that it's made that hard. But another thing I don't like is how, despite we still got a bit of content, I don't like how they aren't changing the formula for the content cycle. Like, it's getting a little repetitive. Like, we all seem to know what comes with each patch. The first patch, it's a remake of the final trial with a really hard difficulty, one new dungeon, a short MSQ. Second patch, the new set in the raid series, more MSQ trials, and then another trial, and then so on and so forth. It's kind of like, or every other patch is slightly different, but the content cycle is getting predictable, and I would wish that they would change things up. And finally, the connections made between Final Fantasy XIV and Nier's universe and the Nier raid story. Despite how I feel about the Ivalice raid series, it had a great story and great world building, and essentially connecting Ivalice to Final Fantasy XIV, like connecting it well. Whereas Yorha Dark Apocalypse fails to do that and has yet to explain its connections to the Final Fantasy XIV world as well. But other than that, I absolutely love this expansion, and I have had and am having a blast with it. So anyways, these are how I would rate the expansions from my least favorite to my most favorite. I hope you guys liked this video. Comment down below what was your least favorite expansion for Final Fantasy XIV and what was your most favorite expansion for this game. You can do least to most favorite or do a numbered list. I just want to hear you guys' thoughts. Anyways, I hope you all loved this video. Subscribe for more Final Fantasy content. Be sure to give this video a like. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch, and I will see you guys later. Be sure to enter the Logitech G600 MMO mouse giveaway. Check it out on my Twitter. I will have more details, and I'll post more details in the video and the description. I hope you guys loved this video. I will see you guys later. Umbruhh, out.